So welcome everyone, and my name's Tom Dillon. Very pleased to welcome to the panel today Dr. Alan Williams and Stu Johnson from Understanding Ag, James Daniel from Precision Grazing, and Joe Howard from Howard Farms in Nottinghamshire. The panel will be discussing the trade-offs between fattening livestock and improving soil health. And Stu will be managing the discussion at the end, so there'll be an open Q&A at the end. So please put questions in the chat as time goes on. Before passing over to Alan, I just would like to mention that Regenerate Outcomes, the company I work for, provides for a one-to-one mentoring service, which is led by Alan, Stu, Carl Richardville, who's also on the call, and their team. So if you're interested, please do check out our website, which I'll put in the chat, and you can find out more about our services. So Alan, over to you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm going to share screen here. Let's see, is my screen sharing?
Not yet for me, Alan, but I'll let Tom.
Yeah. Okay.
There you are. That's good, Alan. So we can see our sales on the screen, and we can see the presentation now.
Yeah, can see it now.
Is it up now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So what I'm going to share with you today here briefly is just we did an analysis of the first 4 years of more than 120 different farms that we are working with. And we looked at what was the progress that they were able to make in those first 4 years and what did it mean to them. So this is the very beginning, and we did shovel tests. This is what the soil looked like on the vast majority of these farms. And as you can see from these pictures, the soil was tight. It was crusted on top, very little to no aggregation. So water infiltration would have been poor. Water retention would have been poor. And overall water cycle, mineral cycle function would have been poor. So over the 4-year period of intentional implementation of what we call the 634, the 6 principles of soil health, and the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship to maximize the 4 ecosystem processes, we found remarkable changes in the soil and the function of that soil, as well as some other things that I'll share with you. So this is what a lot of this same soil looked like by the end of year 4. You can see that it was radically different. We no longer saw the crusting on the soil surface. We no longer had the compacted plated layers in the soil. Instead, we had this nice deep aggregation. And in the advent of this occurring, this is what we saw in year 1. At the end of year 1, they were able to increase the depth of the soil aggregate by an average of 2.3 inches across these 120 plus farms. By the end of year 2, it had increased to 4.5 inches in average aggregate depth. By the end of year 3 to 6.2 inches. Now that's pretty good progress, and that's pretty good linear progress. However, what we saw is that by the end of year 4, the average aggregate depth was almost 15 inches deep. Now, that is a big jump from year 3 to year 4, and this we're seeing quite commonly. And what's occurring here is it takes the first 2 to 3 years to build adequate microbial biomass in the soil, along with the adequate microbial profile, bacteria to fungi to protozoa. And then once we achieved that adequate biomass and profile, we shift over from a linear response to an exponential response. So what else did we see? Well, over that 4-year period, total fungi in the soil increased 176%. Mycorrhizal fungi increased by 153%. Saprophytic fungi by 199%. And plant species diversity in the perennial pasture systems that we were measuring increased 123%. Now, what's important to note here is that none of this was planted. The diversity was the result of the existing seed bank, and the ability of that seed bank with the increased microbial population and aggregation in the soil was now able to respond and to germinate and to become a viable part of the total mix. That's where the diversity came from. So we didn't have to spend any money on seed, on planting it, on fertilizing it, anything like that. This is what nature volunteered over that time period. Other benefits that we noted were significantly enhanced water infiltration and retention, far greater forage biomass production, and over the 4-year period, on the average increase in biomass production compared to the beginning of year 1 was between 3 times and 4 times more total forage biomass dry matter production. We also saw a significant improvement, as I stated earlier, in plant species diversity and an increase in beneficial insects, pollinators, and birds. Animal health was significantly better, coupled with better animal performance. And in the soil, in plants, we saw greater nutrient cycling and greater resilience when we had climatic and weather challenges. Now, I'm going to give you 2 of the principal keys to this occurring. One was a focus on plant recovery and rest after prior grazing events. So plant recovery is the time that it takes a plant to physically and physiologically recover from a grazing event. Now, during the recovery period, what is occurring is that plant is recovering the original leaf material and leaf volume that it had prior to the grazing event, and it's recovering the original root volume and root depth that it had prior to that grazing event. But what that plant is not doing during this recovery period is growing additional biomass over and above what it had prior to the grazing event. And it's also not growing additional root depth and root biomass over and above what it had prior to the last grazing event. That takes rest on top of recovery. And rest is the period of time required after a grazing event recovery for the plant to then grow new root depth, new root biomass, and new plant shoot biomass above the soil surface, and to also build a stronger phytonutrient profile in that plant. So basically, we have recovery of that plant first, then rest on top of recovery. What we have found as the basic rule of thumb here is that however long a period of time it took that plant to reach full recovery, and that may be 15 days, 21 days, 30 days, depending on conditions and the severity of the grazing event, we need to have at least that same amount of time period for rest to occur to grow additional root biomass and depth, for that plant to impart additional phytonutrients and for it to grow more shoot or above ground plant biomass. So again, if it took 21 days for full recovery, we need at least another 21 days of rest before we go back and graze again to have these benefits. And the second thing that we employed on all of these different farms, the 120 plus farms, over that 4-year time period, were varying grazing disruptions. And we have found these disruptions to be critically important. We can make initial progress through an initial disruption, but if we then make that disruption a prescription and we begin to do the same thing over and over because it worked that one time first, and we think, well, that's what I need to do from now on, that's often our biggest mistake. And we need to realize that to continue to make ongoing progress, it's going to take intentional applied disruptions. And the way I like to help people understand this is to talk about a human athlete. For any of you that have been an athlete and competed at a fairly high level, you know that to do that, you can't do the same exercise routine at the same duration and intensity over and over again. If you do that, you're going to stagnate. You're going to hit a wall and stop making progress, and then you're going to go backwards. You can't even maintain the same level of athletic performance. So to become a better and better athlete, we have to introduce planned, purposeful disruptions into our exercise routine. To make our pastures and our livestock perform better, we have to introduce planned, purposeful disruptions. And some of the key disruptions are things like alternating stock density, pounds of animals per acre or per hectare. We can alter rotation patterns across our farm. We can alter grazing heights on and off, alter rest periods. I talked about the importance of rest just a moment ago. If you're doing multiple species of animals like we are, we can alter the species order, alter the time of season or year a paddock is grazed, and even the total number of days it may be grazed in a year. Alter paddock configuration or shape, and even the direction of the paddocks. Plan burns, bale grazing, leader-follower concepts, contour grazing, all of these can also be very important disruptions that we can introduce from time to time to make ongoing progress. And then finally, we can use combinations of disruptions. As an example, I can alter stock density, I can alter rest period, and I can alter paddock configuration or shape, all in the same grazing disruption to even more rapidly increase my rate of progress and then my subsequent animal performance following that. So with that, I'm going to stop and then turn it over to our next presenter.
Right. Wonderful, Alan. Thank you for that. And yeah, evening all. Thank you for joining us. I'll just bring up some of my slides, and whilst I do that, I'll just give you a quick introduction. So I'm James Daniel. I'm the founder and director of Precision Grazing. We're a livestock consultancy business specialising in low input pastoral based systems. I'm also one of the co-founders and directors of Grassroots Farming. And I'll talk about both those businesses and what they do in brief shortly. Can one of you guys on the call just give me a thumbs up or unmute and just let me know that you can see my slides okay? Okay.
Yeah, James, we can see them, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Appreciate that. Okay, guys, so look, great topic, and yeah, I'm going to share with you a bit of my experience and give you a UK-based case study with some data behind it. And I think the challenge we've got in this part of our journey within regenerative farming and improving soil health is that we should have taken more should have taken and done more with regards to soil health and analysis at the start of the journey, and we're only just catching up. So when I started the business, I was aware that improving grazing management had a plethora of benefits for both the environment, the biodiversity, as well as the bottom line, but didn't bother to stop and take any baseline soil assessments other than things that are anecdotal. So fortunately, we started a trial in 2018 to kind of correct that. It would be nice to have started that a few years earlier, but there's good data coming to the fold now. It's really supporting what farmers have been seeing on farm and supporting some of the anecdotal evidence with the facts, which is brilliant to see. So I sit as a director of two businesses. The first one's Precision Grazing. So we're a pastoral-based farm consultancy business, helping farmers make more from their grass. We don't specialise in a particular grazing technique. We're just in support of any management prescription that either aids disruption, but also underpins improved profitability, sustainability where that's appropriate, and helps farmers. Basically makes it more fun to be a livestock farmer. So we run various discussion groups, and we're always looking for new members. And we continue our support across England and in Wales. We run under Farming Connect. Then as director of Grassroots, so what Grassroots is doing is linking restaurants that care where their food comes from with farmers that care how they're producing it. And in putting the two together, we're able to derive a premium for that produce. That business has seen a nice bit of growth of late, working with the likes of Honest Burgers and Oaxaca to supply them with beef. And we're seeking more farmers to supply us. And actually, Joe Howard this evening is one of the first farmers that started supplying Grassroots and continue to work with us. So that's a really cool thing to be involved in, reconnecting farmers with the food they produce. So this is the project I was just discussing in brief. So I started Precision Grazing in 2016 and was cruising around the country working with farmers, the few beef and sheep farmers that started to practice different forms of grazing management. And by 2018, I realised there was a bit of a gap. We were seeing things anecdotally on farm that looked really good, but there wasn't the evidence, the peer-reviewed evidence to back it up. And it was at the same time that in New Zealand they started legislating in some of the districts around and putting limits on the number of animals a holding could have based on historic levels. For them, and I think for the UK kind of government and policymakers, they thought it was the number of cows that was the issue, not how the cows were managed. And now, from my relatively brief experience in the industry, I believed the opposite. I believed it was how the cows were managed that the issue, not the number of cows on the farm or in one paddock at one time. So, fortunately, we were able to attract some EU funding and set up a project with Rotherstead Research on their North Wyke site in mid-Devon to take a cohort of animals to manage one half fairly conventionally, so basically set stocked with some adjustment of stocking rate through the season, and to move to manage the other half under kind of a managed grazing system. So that looked like some set stocked areas in yellow, where the animals just had sort of able to roam and graze as they pleased, next to what we were calling cell grazing areas, really where animals were moved, every 1 to 2 days, with the recovery period adjusted to suit the pasture. And the stocking density in both those systems kind of adjusted to suit the season as well. And that ran for 4 years, and it saw 2 cohorts of animals. We brought in weaned dairy beef calves in the spring of year 1, grazed them for a season, wintered them together on the same diet, split them back out into their groups in the following spring, and then took them through to finish with the aim of finishing as many as possible off grass. And there's a whole plethora of things measured. And looking back now, we probably could have done more for and with the soil, but at the time we acted on the information we knew. Visually by year 4, there was quite a difference, with the set stocked areas being on the left and the cell grazing areas being on the right. So we had a big impact on pasture species composition, in our case converting and diverging towards a more productive species, and on the other side, the set stocking, kind of releasing things that have been in the seed bank for a while that were left ungrazed. In terms of the impact on productivity, so the graphs are showing the kilos of dry matter produced per hectare per year. The darker colour of the bar is the growing season growth, so spring and summer growth, and then the little top-up bar in a lighter colour above is the winter growth. And so what we saw is we saw this big increase which kind of Alan kind of alluded to, and we didn't maybe see as exponential, we saw as quite linear. But from year one, where the systems kind of grew comparative amounts of grass, to the cell grazing, through the impact of the animals and the management, continuing to grow more and more grass. And it's important to say that the plots were divided by contour and soil type, so all the replicates were designed to have as little bias, or as little bias as possible. It's as replicated and scientific as you can conduct in a field situation. So random allocation of animals, random allocation of sites, matched for contour. There was no seeding. There was a little bit of fertiliser put on for maintenance as part of the site's prescription. But what we saw was a change in management over the period of 3 years, pushing up that grass production from a kind of base of 6 tonnes for the set stocking, peaking at nearly 12 tonnes. Now, the grass growth is somewhat relevant relative to the site and its geographical location and space soil fertility, but the difference between the two treatments, especially by that 3rd and 4th year, is pretty stark. Pasture utilisation, as you can imagine, under the cell grazing scenario was better, so the animals were able to eat more of what was available, and that was part of the reason for the change in pasture composition. What was pretty evident in the first couple of years of the project was that the animals in the first cohort worked pretty hard to kind of nail down those docks and other less desirable weed grasses, and to give space for some more clovers and other legumes and productive species of grass to come through. The stocking rate increased, so it actually shows kilos of live weight per hectare. And so in the beginning we were able to achieve a small uplift, although animal performance wasn't great because of the pasture composition challenges and a very dry 2018 for those that can remember that. And then in more normal years, 2019 through to 21, we were able to keep lifting the stocking rate. I think there's a saying that the mark of a regenerative system is one in which the carrying capacity or the productivity continues to increase, and so we certainly saw that in the project and in the trial. Whereas the set stocking productivity stayed about the same. Every time we tried to pop another animal in, they just grazed the whole thing too low, covers dropped, growth slowed, and we had to take something off. So here we've got production, and this is the average of the 2 years. So cohort 1 was 2018 and 19, and cohort 2, 2020 and 2021. And this is kilos of live weight per hectare, relevant relative to the site and the quality of animal. So cohort 1, we did 500 kilos of cell grazing and about 350 set stocking, so there's already an uplift. Go forward into the next 2 years, and we hit nearly 900 kilos of live weight per hectare. For the cell grazing, we sat at about 600 for the set stocking, so 300 kilos more live weight per hectare. At today's money, if you believe the market reports, that's about £1,200 per hectare extra live weight produced over that 2-year period. From the soil, we did measure some soil parameters, just perhaps not in the depth that we would have done so now, knowing what we know. We looked at soil carbon in terms of tonnes per hectare, but just the top 10 centimetres. And so whilst we saw some variance depending on the season, we saw at the end of the 4 or 5 year period there a slight marked increase in soil carbon retained or stored in the top 10 centimetres. And that measurement is a little bit nuanced by the depth of it, but it's what we did at the time. In terms of soil structure, because at times we had a lot of live weight on a very small area, and on the shoulders of the season, for those that know that site in Devon, it's ridiculously wet. Especially on the shoulders, especially spring and autumn. So we caused a bit of soil disturbance. However, despite there being slightly more compaction by petrometer and by spade in the autumn, because of that winter rest period, that had always recovered and repaired by the time we got back to spring. We looked at nutrient leaching because that was one of the key reasons given by the kind of legislators for reducing the number of animals. And we did this both looking at overland flow and infiltration with cups buried in the ground. The level of nutrient runoff was similar between both grazing methods, despite the stocking density for the cell grazing, in terms of the kilos of live weight per hectare, being nearly twice that of the set stocked areas. So therefore you can say that the cell grazing areas, so if you like the adaptive grazing management, had a lower leaching potential per kilo of live weight produced. So in essence, those areas being managed with more stock were producing less, were leaching less nutrients per kilo live weight per head of animal. Now, we talked about this was a discussion around the trade-offs, and so there was a trade-off in transition, and I believe it can be overcome with management, but what we saw is the set stocked areas growing better through really all of the cohorts, with a marked difference in the second cohort, so in years 3 or 4. And so what we had is we had 4 years of continued productivity improvement and continued pasture quality improvement. We had increased live weight per hectare, but we had slightly lower per head performance. And so it's a little bit of what you managed for. For us, the management was focused on the live weight, kilos live weight per hectare. And so there is a balance between performance per animal, performance per hectare, and it's deciding what fits the business in terms of maybe those days to finish target. And there's a trade-off or a balance to be had or to have there with regards to that. We certainly had a positive impact on the soil, and the extra density of animals was of no negative impact to the soil. But there was a trade-off, or there's a play there with around performance per hectare and performance per head in doing so. So I think it's really worth being aware of what they're managing for and what levers to pull to get the kind of outcomes you're looking for. There, I'll stop sharing there and I'll hand over to Joe.
Okay, so hopefully everyone can hear and see these slides that I've just shared. Good evening, everyone. Is that all coming up all right?
That's perfect, Joe.
So, right, I just need to scoot back to the start. I'm giving away what's coming up later in the talk now. So so I'm Joe Howard, based in the North Nottinghamshire. So we're in a very arable part of the country, and very dry sandland farm. Family has farmed on the farm here I'm the 5th generation, so 1888 they started, and that's just a picture of the field in front of the yard, how my great granddad used to farm. When my dad came home from college in the mid-70s, he was taught it's all about gross margins and looking at individual crop productivity and margin levels. And at the same time, he managed to get an irrigation license. So he looked at the figures and basically chucked out the sustainable farming system that my great-granddad, my great-great-granddad, and my great-granddad had managed to do for the best part of 100 years of having a couple of a rotation of livestock with arable cropping. So looking at the figures, all the livestock disappeared, started irrigation and started growing a lot of root veg. My dad was then involved in setting up a producer organisation called Fresh Grow, which is still going well today. But what sort of happened in that 2 decades was, as a family business, was very successful, because on the back of it, the family bought a second farm. It also opened up the opportunities to go into contract farming. So from my dad being brought up on a 400-acre farm with 2 brothers and a sister, all farming it together, we ended up owning best part of 1,000 acres and contract farming another 3,000 acres. And then also renting in best part of 1,000 acres for veg production. So as a business, hugely successful. But by the late 90s, my dad and my uncles were realizing that they'd caused a lot of damage to the soil. The arable performance was getting pretty desperate. So in my dad's view, my uncle's view, it was better to put some grass back in the rotation and at least not lose money trying to grow either veg or cereals, and just give the land a bit of a rest. So a bit of an overview as to our sort of cropping rotation now is we do have grass back in the rotation. We are still growing the veg. That's still a big part of the business, and still a profitable part of the business. So we're not just a traditional sort of stock farm. We've got all the infrastructure in so we can move animals sort of from one end of the farm to the other. There's walkways, there's water troughs sort of everywhere we need it to be. But we are still running that rotation. This is just sort of an example of the cropping, how there's rotational grass, there's fodder beet, there's potatoes, there's cereals. I guess it's trying to be cake and eat it. We're trying to do a good job at being arable farmers, but we also want to look after the soil and the environment. And we also want to make a margin from producing beef. So the carrot enterprise is still the biggest part of the business. We grow the majority of the Chantilly carrots in the UK, which from a soil health perspective, this is absolutely the worst way you can possibly farm for the soil. We de-stone, we bed till, we drill, we then harvest all winter, we put straw on to keep the frost off. So we then have to work even harder for the rest of the rotation to make up for the damage that we've caused by growing the veg. We have been growing a lot of cereals. So we are in a way still stuck in that rut of being drawn in by the big toys, like the balers, the combines. That is part of the business that is reducing. I'm actually stuck in a little bit of a rut on some of the contract farming blocks of land that the landlords that we farm for are just interested in higher value root crops here and now. And they are not thinking further ahead for what we do into the soil long term. So we actually run two quite different systems. The contract farming is still very much out and out arable farming, while our own farms are pretty much, not say all livestock, but we are getting more and more livestock back into them and less root veg. So I just saw a message coming up that my slides aren't sharing. I'm not sure if that's for everybody or if that's just a few people that aren't seeing the slides.
It's still working from my side, Joe, but yeah, perhaps between us, Tom.
Yeah, it's been working. It's been working for me as well.
Okay.
I'm just wondering whether if I share my screen. I mean, yeah, so Stuart's also said he can't see the slides, but I can,
Okay.
and so can James.
Okay.
Do you fancy stopping and resharing, Joe? That's worth a try, isn't it?
Yeah, try that.
Yeah, so if I stop sharing.
Other people can see them. Okay, this is...
Okay. Well, I'll reshare and hopefully that comes through.
Okay, it's good from my side again, Joe.
Yeah.
And I guess at this stage, if anyone who can't see the slides now, perhaps leave the meeting and come back in, and there's a fair chance that might fix it.
Yeah. Okay. Although it's not sharing now on the screen, I don't think. There we go. I'll click back through to where I was. So with having grass in the rotation, my dad did go and buy a couple of Angus suckler cows, and yeah, 2 cows became 4, and we grew them up to about 400 sucklers. And as you sort of can see in these photos here, we were very much trying to copy what the spring block grazing dairy herds were doing. So we were plate metering, we were growing a lot of ryegrasses, we were trying to make the most of forage. And yeah, I managed to pick a few slides out, a few photos here that shows that even though we're in Nottinghamshire, we can grow some grass. But generally what we were finding with the ryegrasses is when it doesn't rain for a month, which can be the case for us in this part of the country, the grass can very quickly turn that very horrible shade of brown. So it started to question, yeah, whether ryegrasses was right for the soil, and whether we're actually doing enough to benefit the soil, because ultimately that's why we had the livestock in the rotation. So I guess after a couple of dry years of seeing lots of droughted off grass, we went down more of the herbal lay mix, which, yeah, this is what we're seeing here. makes it harder to manage your grass. So you can't necessarily just plate meter every week and get accurate readings. You have to all but take a step back away from that and trust the principles that you're growing forage in front of you, a wedge of forage. If you can utilize it, brilliant. If there's too much to utilize, well, you let it get trampled and then you come back and probably graze more of it off the next round if we've then hit a drought scenario then. So yeah, we sort of mid-drought, as you see, it does turn dry, and that's a big part of our rotation and planning, is trying to build that resilience in the soil. As Alan said from the start, it's the soil needs to have better sort of water cycling, better water retention, better water infiltration. Our single biggest business KPI is how much rain we get through May, June, July, and August, no matter what crop we're growing. So if we can try and utilize more of the rain that we do get by holding it within the soil for longer, and ultimately, if I flick back, for every extra day I can keep a grass paddock looking greener like this, it's better than it looking like that. And it's not going to change overnight. We're not going to change it by months or weeks, but we might just change it by a couple of days, which will then be a step in the right direction. So yeah, during the summer, we'll generally let the covers get a bit bolder, a bit bigger in front of the animals before grazing it down. And yeah, we'll often end up with putting silage out if the grass growth really does struggle through the summer. We were doing a lot with the sucklers. I was part of the AHDB Strategic Beef and Lamb Programme, and I was questioning our figures. I was looking at the KPIs. We were doing okay, but we couldn't make it stack up financially. Meanwhile, at the same time, I tried to set up a dairy on the next door neighbour's estate, and it fell through at the 11th hour, but we ended up with the opportunity to take a block of land on up in Scotland to run a spring block grazing herd with a share milker. And that gave me a great insight into the spring block calving grazing systems. I felt that was a great way to learn how to graze and manage sort of a suckler herd in the same way that they were doing it with dairy cows. It also gave us the option to bring some of the beef cross calves to run alongside our own sucklers. And initially it was because they were available. I didn't truly believe it was going to work, but we ran them through our forage-based system, and they actually were growing quicker than our suckler bred young stock were, and they finished every bit as well. And probably a big part of it is they were a lot easier to work with. Yeah, the suckler herds were outdoors, they were half wild. We were taking a life in our hands at calving time, whereas these crossbreds are so much easier to work with. So during COVID, we decided to get rid of all the suckler cows, partly because the cull values went up through the roof, and we'd got the option to bring in more dairy cross calves into the system. So the system we now run with the livestock is the spring block born. We have some contract rearers that are up near the source dairy farms. They will bring them through till they're off milk, and then they come down to us, so from the middle of May into June, and they'll go out onto grass paddocks. As you can see, this photo here, we've got them on pig feeders. So these are on ad lib feeders when they first arrive. We give them plenty of room in the grass paddock. And then once they've settled in, we'll start to put them behind electric to manage their grass intakes. So yeah, these animals would be sort of 4 months old as they arrived last spring. This is just a quick clip just to see you what the animals sort of look like. Because yeah, a big part of this discussion is, can you actually produce animals that the market wants successfully, as well as trying to look after the soil? So I just wanted to show what the animals are that we're dealing with, and then I'll also show some pictures as to how well they finish as well. So this is before we've gotten behind electric. So they've only been with us for about 2 weeks or a week or so at this point. We then, for the winter, because we're on very light land, we outdoor winter them behind electric. This is a couple of photos on some fodder beet. Again, we're not following all of the regen principles with this, because as we graze across a field, we're leaving bare earth behind us. We are going in and drilling rye sort of all but weekly behind the animals, put a back fence up behind them, drill some rye, and at least that can then start coming through green through the winter. But it doesn't grow much. You can see a hint of green from what we did before Christmas, but it's not exactly a grass cover of 2,500 per hectare on it. We then get them back out to grass the following spring, so they're just over a year. This is just a clip of a group moving. This is the neighbour's parkland that we rent. So these will be sort of 18-month, 15, 16, nearly 18-month-old animals, just moving from one paddock to another. On the neighbour's farm just here, this is some parklands. He doesn't want electric fences putting across it, so we basically have 7 paddocks, and we rotate between the 7 paddocks. So it's not true techno grazing or true precision grazing. It's more of a mob grazing approach on this particular block. To get the finishing, we do bring them indoors and put them on a TMR to get that final finish. We've got some reasonable facilities, and that's made it a lot easier to bring them through. And again, I'll just show you a little clip of this animal is probably about 20 months old, and it's just a bit of an example as to what these crossbreds animals can look like. The diet that we keep them on the TMR is predominantly homegrown, so it's either sort of a lucerne, herbal ley grass mix with maize silage, and then we do bring in some purchase feed to put in as a concentrate. So at the moment they're on 3 kilos per head per day of some brewer's grains to help get that extra fat cover on them. I don't know if you can see that. This is the last 2 kill sheets for what we sent over the last couple of weeks to Dovecot Park. The one on the left is steers, one on the right is all heifers. Again, I just wanted to show that even though these animals are out of what would be described as grass rats, we can still get that level of finish on them for what the market's wanting, because that is a big part of farming, is only producing what the market actually wants to buy from you. And I guess, yeah, just picking up on bits that James and Alan mentioned earlier, in my opinion, there's no doubt whatsoever that animals can produce good quality carcass on a forage-based system. I guess the trade-off is your stocking rate to keep your overheads diluted but still have the turnover. And that's the trade-off that every business is going to be very different to see. So yeah, I guess we'll open it up to some questions. So if I stop sharing at that point, I guess.
Thanks, Joe. Kyle's going to step in because Stu's technology isn't working.
Yep. Thanks everybody for presenting. I think there were a couple of questions in the chat, and if anybody has any other questions they want to ask, please do enter those into the chat. We've got a wealth of information, so make sure to take advantage of that. So David asked the question, do you apply these disruptions, Alan, that you mentioned all at once or one at a time or all together? What you answered in the chat, but for people that haven't seen it, what would you respond to that with?
Well, certainly not all at once. That would be wholly inappropriate and unmanageable, by the way. So you can apply disruptions individually, and we often do. but you can also combine specific disruptions. For instance, there's many cases where we can have 2 or 3 disruptions combined into a single grazing event. The other thing about the disruptions is that they're not arbitrarily applied. We don't just put them all in a hat and draw them out and randomly apply one versus another. We want to make sure that we're applying disruptions relative to the observations that we're making and the goals and objectives that we have at any particular point in time. And we've also got to realize that certain disruptions are going to require longer recovery and rest periods after that disruption. For instance, if I'm going to do an ultra high stock density disruption, intentionally to get a very high degree of trample, to stimulate the latent seed bank and to apply a lot of fertility and biology, that is going to require a longer recovery and rest period versus maybe some of the other disruptions. So again, you can apply individually, you can apply 2 or 3 at a time, but again, remember that these are intentional and you're applying them relative to observations and immediate goals and objectives.
Thanks, Alan. And that kind of ties into David's second question. When you're thinking about rest and recovery periods, he's asking, would you follow that formula throughout the year as the grass growth rate alters? So how do you work in the time of year and grass growth rate into those recovery times?
Yeah, so the beautiful thing about what we call adaptive grazing is that there are no prescriptions or formulas here, and that's very intentional. So you're not trying to do the same thing all the time. As a matter of fact, we're intentionally trying not to do the same thing over and over again, because then it becomes prescriptive. And as I said, at one point during my presentation, whenever we change something, then that is a disruption, whether we realize it or not. And we'll often see something good happen as a result of that disruption. But then our tendency is to begin to think that, well, I did this and that worked, so now I got to hone in on that and do it that way from now on. That again is often where we make our next mistake. So we've got to be very cognizant and careful of that. And so as we apply these disruptions, what we want to do is we want to understand the time of the year, the conditions. Are we dry? Joe showed some pictures where he got drouthy at times, right? Although Joe, Gabe Brown may differ with you on what a drought is or not. But Gabe would say, well, there's never a drought in the UK, but yeah, for you, that's a drought, and so there are certain disruptions that we can apply when it's drouthy. There's others that are better to apply when we have adequate soil moisture and rapid growing conditions. And then those times and those influences are going to definitely influence recovery and rest. So recovery and rest are going to differ depending upon the time of the year and the conditions that we have at that particular time. This is where our observation is so important. Don't set a formula and think that recovery is always going to happen after X number of days, and therefore rest is always X number of days. Conditions and observations absolutely matter.
And one final question for you. When you're observing your pasture after a graze, do you have any indicator plants that you look for specifically to know that recovery has been completed?
Yeah, I will principally base that on my grasses that are in the mix. What I have found is that if I have adequate recovery and rest with my grasses, I typically am going to have adequate recovery and rest with the forbs, with the legumes, and the other species that are in the mix, in the diversity. So what I'm looking for there, Kyle, is on a grass plant, an individual stem of grass, I want to see at least 4 fully formed blades of grass or leaves of grass that come all the way out to a sharp tip or point. If there's still blunt edges on any of these blades of grass, we have not reached full recovery yet, much less rest. So I want them each to come out to a nice sharp tip, and at full recovery, those tips will begin to turn tan or even brown. So that's what I go by to gauge full recovery. But again, remember, that's recovery. That is not rest. So there are times when I will go back and graze as part of my disruptions after recovery without additional rest. Okay, so you can do that, but you don't want to do that all the time. So at other times, specifically when I want to grow additional root biomass and rooting depth and additional above ground biomass, and oh, by the way, if I'm wanting to sequester a lot more carbon, it's the rest that's going to do that, not the recovery. So if I'm really looking at a lot more carbon in my soil, I'm going to need that rest. Okay. So the rest, again, is always on top of recovery, and the rest is where I'm going to grow the additional root depth, root biomass, shoot biomass, and sequester more carbon.
Thanks, Alan. Next question is from Caroline. She asks, has anyone looked at the nutritional quality of the product, whether crops or meat, before and since interventions? Does anybody want to start on that?
I can just touch. So one of the outputs of the trial Rothamsted was looking at meat quality, but the parameters, well, the meat nutritional density in terms of omega-3, omega-6 ratio, work is still awaiting lab results. The meat tenderness was not significantly different between the two treatments, but I'm sure Alan can maybe touch on the nutritional part. But for us, the meat tenderness, in terms of what the customer's perception of the product quality, there was no difference between the two treatments.
So yes, we've done very extensive phytonutrient analysis, and looking at, comparing the different systems, more conventional grazing systems to adaptive grazing systems, and then comparing the degree of diversity and the degree of biology that we've built in the soil. So we've looked at all of that and are continuing to do so. Principally, we're doing this with Dr. Stefan Van Vliet and his team of researchers. It also involves Dr. Fred Provenza. And here's what we're finding, and very clearly, and this data is quite revealing, but we are finding very definitively that the better job you're doing with grazing, then we are seeing much higher, not just a little bit higher, but much higher phytonutrient profiles. And this includes the fatty acids, it includes the vitamins and minerals, and it includes the entire phytochemical complex, which are a lot of compounds that are full of antioxidants and anti-inflammatories. And the two keys, what we're finding also very definitively, is that where we're seeing the highest phytonutrient profiles in the meat or the milk, if it's dairy, are where we are significantly improving the soil microbial biomass and profile, and where we are also significantly increasing the plant species diversity in the pastures that they're grazing in. So those two factors, soil biology and plant species diversity, are absolute keys to improving the phytonutrient profile.
It's probably, in my opinion, a little bit of common sense that when you've got a full diverse diet, and that'd be the same for us, and you want a varied diet, bit of meat, bit of veg, fiber, all the rest of it. Livestock will be the same, but also soil is the same. So soil needs to have biodiversity of different rooting depths, different species. So that'll lead to different microsobia, and there'll be a level of science that human has not even scratched the surface of yet. But in my very simplistic mind, I always just relate it back to, well, where has evolution brought us to this point in time? It wasn't grazing animals on a single species of ryegrass. It was animals wandering across the big grass plains. They'll graze seed heads. They'll graze bits of the younger shoots of grass. So in a way, you can come at it from both sides, science, or you can come back from effectively common sense. And yeah, to me, that's all part of the catch-22. You start looking after the soil better, that gives you a better balance of forage, that gives you healthier animals, that means less wormers, therefore you put in more probiotic cow shit back into the soil. The whole system starts to cycle by itself and help itself.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. Oftentimes we can rely too heavily on the science, or where's the science, but common sense can get us really far in a lot of these discussions too. You're exactly right. So Sue asks, question for Alan, how did you test the changes in microbial levels throughout the grazing rotation?
Yeah, it was really very simple. We looked at using PLFA analysis. So collecting soil samples routinely and measuring that actual biological profile in the soil. And through PLFA analysis, we can look at the total living microbial biomass, the functional group diversity that exists there in the microbes. We can look at total bacteria and then major classes, total fungi and major classes, protozoa, that type of thing. And to complement that, we also did what we call the shovel test, where we would routinely, literally dig in the soil, take divots out of the soil, and physically, there are certain characteristics of the soil, including aroma, as well as what we can visually see, that also fall directly in line with the PLFA results. And so both physically and through the laboratory, we can determine what our biological profiles are.
Thanks, Alan. Yep. So for those that don't know, I currently live and work in the UK as well, and that's a challenge that we've been working on in the UK, is finding a soil lab to run these biological tests that the United States offers, such as the Haney test. The PLFA is offered by more and more labs now, which is good. But yeah, the full suite of soil biological tests isn't currently available in the UK. There's Eurofins in Holland, but many people have some issues with that lab. So yep, we'll if anybody's interested, we'll keep you up to date on the potential to run these tests on your own farm in the UK. Hopefully some labs will pick it up here quickly in the future. So next question, Dan asks, James and Alan, do you think that the daily live weight gain will improve over time compared to the conventionally ran system?
Yeah, I believe we will. We've got anecdotal evidence from a range of clients that support it. The challenge within doing a research project is you've got to try and, because it's research, you've got to try and limit the amount of variables, and in doing so, you then maybe can't manage. You have to manage somewhat prescriptively rather than adaptively. So there's times within that trial that things have to be prescriptive in terms of maybe the rest period or recovery period, and the grazing heights, and that wasn't always optimal. But it was to a point where a member of staff can carry out those instructions for 2 weeks and it can be reviewed again. Animal genetics play a huge role, and the difference between cohort 1 and 2 was the increase in number of sort of native beef breeds in these dairy cross animals, and that had a big improvement. And I've certainly seen that with clients where there's a transition the farm will go through, and I think as Alan and sort of our data shows, yeah, there is a journey, and going around that can be a bit challenging if you haven't got everything lined up. So if you haven't quite got a breed that's suitable, you haven't quite got the pasture type that's suitable. And I think one of our challenges in the UK is dealing with a lot of ryegrass dominant pastures. that like to be grazed and managed in a certain way, which is not always optimal for animal performance nor soil health. And so actually I've got a question back to you, Alan, maybe you could touch on it now, is how do we transition those systems away from that ryegrass dominant sward that we know isn't now optimal for these businesses and is potentially limiting the animal performance. But yeah, we've had good success with clients matching and exceeding animal performance. It needs adaptive management rather than prescriptive management, which the trial had to work under.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. And what we have clearly seen, and I personally have grass finished tens of thousands of head of beef cattle, and I don't know how many sheep, many thousands of head of sheep through the years. And and what we have absolutely found is that as we do increase that soil biology, improve the biology and the nutrient cycling and water cycling in the soil, and we increase the diversity in our pastures, then yes, we absolutely see an improvement in not just total kilograms produced per acre or per hectare, but we also see a significant increase in individual animal average daily gain. And to Joe's earlier point, yes, there is a lot of this that is or should be common sense, but yet we see many grazers that apparently aren't, following even the common sense in a lot of what we're doing here. So we do need to infuse a lot more common sense to go along with what we're doing. But yes, average daily gain will increase as well as total pounds produced per acre or per hectare.
Yeah, I'll completely agree with that. From the growth rates we've seen on ryegrasses to what we'll see on herbal lays, we've had animals doing over like 1.25 kilos per day just on grass. But I'll be as guilty as any farmer that you look at your figures and you start looking into spreadsheets and you look at your overheads and your numbers, and you start to push that stocking rate. Because if I can just keep another 10% of animals through, we're growing more grass than we were 2 years ago, therefore I can increase. I think there's a danger you fall off a bit of a cliff edge and you end up getting in front of the grass, and then you actually are eating away from the resilience of the grass, not building resilience in it. And I've definitely been guilty of that, you get carried away with what stocking rate you think you can run, and then actually you very quickly unravel and go backwards rather than forwards. So I think it takes a lot of discipline not to overstock.
Yep, definitely. Alan, one thing that intrigued me when I went to my first Soil Health Academy that you ran, you talked about the changing leaf morphology as a soil health system improves and the microbial abundance and diversity improves. Can you touch on that? Because it almost feels like getting increase from nothing. You're getting the same plant, but you're just getting more out of each individual plant. And I think that might be important to touch on too.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Kyle. And that is something that we are now seeing over and over, is that when we improve that soil biology and we have greater diversity out there and everything that's growing, we actually begin to see very positive changes in individual plant species morphology. Let me give you some examples. So example, like if we take a grass, we'll see that the individual blades of grass are now growing quite a bit longer than you would have thought they could grow. We are also seeing the width of that blade of grass increase, and even the texture. A lot of times on grasses, we can have this sort of rough, almost sandpaper texture, but yet as that morphology shifts and improves, it develops a much more velvety texture to it. And we're seeing the same thing in our forbs and our legumes. For instance, I've noted if we look at like a broadleaf plantain as an example, in many pastures, those leaves are, about like this in terms of width and length, but yet I have now seen individual leaves of broadleaf plantain that are as big as a platter, a serving platter. So, and it's the same plant. We didn't plant different plantain in there. It's the same plants, the same species, but because of the enhanced biology in the soil, we're seeing that morphology change for the better. So even the same individual plant is producing a lot more biomass through this improvement in morphology.
Absolutely. And soil aggregation, having proper oxygen levels, gas exchange, water exchange, the way I think about it in my common sense thinking is that when the soil environment is stressful, the plants are going to be stressed. And what's their number one goal? Pop up, get to a head, reproductive stage, because, oh my gosh, things aren't going so well. I need to reproduce. But if you improve the system, then they can put more time and energy into the non-reproductive parts of the plant, and exactly change the morphology like Dr. Williams is saying there. Yep.
And I'll make one other quick comment on that, Kyle, and that is, I'm also a former university researcher, and the comment I want to make is this, is that when we do research very conventionally, and unfortunately, way too much of the research being done over the last few decades has been what I would call very conventional, and that means a reductionist model, then we often limit our findings in that research. Okay. And whereas if we do our research from a more observational standpoint and we account for more variables by being able to do that, then we find that what we thought we knew from the conventional research no longer adheres and applies. It's no longer correct. It is correct under those conventional systems. But once you alter the system, then the results are not the same. So the way we do research can radically alter the results, and we have to understand and realize that.
Thanks, Alan. Sue brings up a great point. All of this is nice, but does it make money? So she asked, did you compare the costs between the two systems, James? Which one was more profitable?
We didn't for the project, because the nuance of the project is that the group size to get the replicates, we're managing 5 to 7 animals, so the labour overhead was pretty significant. The data I draw for in terms of does it make a profit? Well, yeah, we've got a range of clients that through the mechanics of improving grazing management alone would reduce inputs, maintain or increase output, and if we save a pound, we make a pound back. And if we can do that whilst building soil health and increasing our carrying capacity, then that's really a good thing. But I think Joe's also got some numbers, or something a more of a business case, and who have seen the insight into his business. So yeah, I'll leave with you, Joe, about what you've seen and realised.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely by having that extra resilience in terms of more soil biology, more soil health, and therefore coping with wet climatic events as well as dry climatic events has definitely helped our finances on it. I was questioning myself when we were doing the sucklers, to be honest. Personal view is sucklers is very, very hard unless there's a particular reason where a suckler animal needs to be sort of whether it's on some hill grazing or something. But from switching over to the dairy crossers, yes, there's good money in it. Yeah, we are doing well. Obviously, beef price at the moment is on fire, so that's going to be helping. But everything's got to be related back to pence per kilo of cost of production, and that is going to vary massively depending on the season, depending on where you are in your production cycle. And I wouldn't even like to be able to say when those baby calves arrive with us in May and June, and they are on, say, 2 kilos of cake per head per day, at what point should we wean them off cake? And I did 2 years ago, and we had a dry spell. I kept them on cake, and they were starting to chew through more and more ad lib cake, but their growth rates were through the roof. So you take that spot growth rate with your cost of production, allowing for your overheads. And that was actually a cheaper pence per kilo to produce the meat than if we'd got animals that were either weaned off the nuts and were just on grass or just on, say, 2 kilos of cake. But you also then have to look forward on those animals for the next season, the next winter. How well did they cope that next season? And at the time, I was convinced that they would actually cope with the winter better because I pushed them harder. But they did cope okay, but some of the slightly smaller animals coped equally well. And by the time we came through to the finishing, if anything, I'd just pushed them a little bit too hard too young. So there is no hard and fast rule where the sweet spot is in economics, but the more resilience you can build in and the more you can grow animals on forage rather than feeding silage, I still end up working back to the very similar figures that I was probably taught 20 years ago when I was over in New Zealand, 22 years ago. If you could graze grass and it's 60 pence a kilo, silage will be 120 pence a kilo, and concentrate will be at least 240 pence a kilo. So the more you can do from grazed forage, and I still think it's crazy that the obsession is to bring animals inside, and then you've got to use tractors to bring your feed in, then you've got to muck spread, and then you've got to cultivate that in. Yeah, cows are very clever, or sheep are very clever, that they've got legs and they'll crap where they're eating, which is where you want the muck. But no, I think we're doing extremely well financially with the way that we've made the changes to try and look after the soil health. And then it becomes a win-win. We're looking after the environment, and we're more resilient, and we're more profitable.
That's awesome to hear. Congratulations on that. Alan, you unmuted. Did you have something to say, or should I move on to the next one?
Well, I'll just make it very quick. Everything that we do has to point back to net profitability. Otherwise, why are you going to do it? So yes, this is profitable, and we're constantly measuring net profitability, and especially net profitability per acre or per hectare. That's really important that we take a look at that.
Thank you. Okay, last question that I can see. Oh, Dan just put another one in, but David asked, as we focus on increasing fungal ratio, is it the case that bacterial populations increase also? And can fungal populations get too high for grazing conditions? Maybe I'll start with that and pass to somebody else. The way I see it, as a soil scientist and studying fungal populations specifically, as soil health increases, the rising tide rises all boats. That's kind of how I see it. But from the beginning, most of our soils have such a low level of fungal populations that initial rise, even if both are rising, the fungal population rises from basically null to something, and that drastically changes the ratio, even if the bacterial population is increasing as well. Does anybody have a similar observation or challenge it?
Well, what we're seeing, and we've got, tens of thousands of these tests that we've taken a look at and referenced it back to the actual performance in the pastures and the performance of the animals and all of that, is that, first of all, we do want to increase the total living microbial biomass. And yes, that includes the bacteria, along with the fungi and the protozoa. But in terms of the best ratios for performance of everything out there in a pasture, not a woodland situation, but a pasture or even a crop field, is that when we can increase the fungal component of the population to between 20 and 30% of the total living microbial biomass, then everything is functioning a lot more optimally. We get far better water cycling, far better nutrient cycling, far better resiliency, and our animals perform better, and the phytonutrient profile in the end products is significantly better. So that's what we have seen. And it would be hard in a cropping or pasture situation, it's going to be very, very hard to get fungal component too high. That's pretty much not going to happen. Okay.
Yep, great points. I was just reading recently that, we always think, or we read that the fungal to bacteria ratio, the fungal population gets larger than the bacterial in that forest environment. And the simple explanation is the soil becomes naturally more acidic, and that's what the fungus prefer. The bacteria don't like it so well, so it just becomes that kind of issue. And like Dr. Williams is saying, if it's not a forest setting, it won't naturally get to those acidic ranges per se naturally. You can acidify your soil with fertilizers and that kind of thing, but you're not going to get the fungal population rising in that situation. So yeah, good points there. And then last one by Dan. He says, you're still putting in herbal lays, etc. Do you think you will get to a point where the natural seed bank will do it for you?
I guess, yeah, on our rented in parkland and sort of riverland, we haven't reseeded that. Partly because it's the landlord, it's in front of a wedding venue. We just can't. The riverland, it's another landlord, and we're just not allowed. So you manage it through grazing, and then over the course of 5 years, maybe 10 years of rotationally grazing it, we realize that we've got far more clover in there. And then you start to get the cocksfoots growing through, and the timothys, and all those species that probably never really ever got seeded in the first place. But the seed bank's there somehow. Right, how nature works, I don't quite know sometimes. But how you manage it promotes the species that grow. And I guess James showed that on that picture when the set stocking, how many docks you got there compared to the rotationally grazing. When you don't have to go in and start spot spraying because you've got thistles, that's going to allow your clover to develop more.
Yep, I would agree. James, Allen, anything to add?
Well, what we have seen is that, yes, the existing seed bank, as you build this appropriate microbial profile and get that fungal component up, okay, in between that 20 and 30%, and as we build the depth of aggregation in the soil, we see ever increasing response from the existing seed bank. So yes, you can get perennial pastures to the point that you no longer have to go in and renovate and seed herbal lays and things like that. They will naturally maintain the diversity and the forbs and everything else that you're trying to seed in. And we have now documented, for instance, on my own personal farm, now more than 155 different plant species growing in the pastures. And we didn't plant any of those 155. Okay. They all were a result of the seed bank, but that happened over the course of years, right? And building that aggregate and building the biology.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the control stewardship and now the SFI schemes and payments for herbal lays are obviously having a real biasing influence on how people are going to attempt to bring diversity in. So in some ways they may give a kickstart, but unless they're managed well, they're just going to incur an additional overhead cost. So there's an opportunity and a risk with those, I think. The chat, I guess, or position we have and we discuss with our clients is, we want a perennial system where we don't need to reseed. And so we'll use tools like standing hay or maybe bale grazing to try and sow those seeds a little bit quicker and move desirable species around the farm. And we're also interested in using the tool of rest after recovery to try and achieve that as well. And it's a little bit nuanced by season, whether we get the dry period for seeds to set, whether we get the timing of events to take place in the right order to see success. But certainly legume increasing as artificial fertilizer reduces has been a key theme, and there's a real interest if we can achieve the biodiversity. I think the herbal lays we're growing work well in a rotational system. I don't think necessarily they're the best fit for a kind of pastoral system because of the overhead cost and because of the risk associated with them. So yeah, that's kind of my piece. I think we're fortunate in the UK. We've got a very forgiving climate with reasonably reliable rainfall. We can get away with a lot of things here that we wouldn't do elsewhere. And so and equally, we can grow huge amounts of biomass if we get it right. So our ability to accelerate and improve soil health very quickly, I think, is our pretty unique advantage on the kind of world stage when it comes to kind of soil health and making change on farm. Alan, a question for you. You obviously saw and heard about Joe's system and his rotation. And we saw you present your findings that were in year 4, you get a real big kick in kind of microbial activity. So given Joe's got 3 years of grass or 3 years of herbal lays, I just wondered on comments, and I know if you had some experience working with kind of cropping or farmers as opposed to along with ranchers.
Yeah, I would anticipate that Joe would see a significant increase and a very rapid increase in the biology of the soil, the total living microbial biomass, the fungal to bacterial ratio, all of that, and therefore see an exponential jump. Now, the key, though, is always, and James, you really alluded to this, was, okay, in the meantime, we can't do anything that sets it back, right? Because you can set it back. So as long as we're continuing to introduce some good disruptions and manage our grazing well and those recovery and rest well, then yes, Joe should be at the point that he is very, very close to going from linear results to this exponential result.
We certainly see that first year of a grass, it's pretty poor. The second year of a grass, it's getting better, but it's still pretty poor. By the time we get to the third year, we start thinking, oh, it's working. It's got that sort of dark green color to it. We're not obviously not through fertilizer, just through the species that's there. And then we go and cultivate it out and put potatoes in or something. So yeah, we are actually planning to change that to a 5-year lay for that very reason. And actually accepting that we don't put the carrots in our own rotation on our own farms. Yeah. And it's, as I said right at the start, we are caught a little bit really in between a rock and a hard place where we contract farm, because I'd love to be able to put the herbal lays in there, but the landlords are just not interested, which is frustrating because I've tried to talk them through the figures of it, and I'm convinced I've got the figures to back it up that it will be better long term financially, but they just do not want to go down that route. And I'm sure there's a lot of farms like that across the UK and probably across the world, isn't it, that they don't like the change.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, Tom, this will be the last question, I think, if you want to close out after this one. Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay. David's last question, he asks Alan and James, what's your opinion on total grazing, total defoliation, or non-selective grazing?
Go on, Alan, I'll let you.
James, you want to go first? Or...
Who wants to jump on the sword?
I thought we'd avoided sort of these traps that come in through questions quite well until the end. So go on, Alan, you go first, and I'll follow your lead. Thank
you, James. All right, I'm just going to answer it very straightforward and very honestly. If it is a prescriptive system, and 99% of the time that I've seen that system implemented, it is prescriptive. They're basically repeating the same thing over and over again. Then, because initially you have introduced a disruption, right? Because you weren't total grazing before, and then all of a sudden you're total grazing, you may notice a benefit and a positive response. But if you keep doing that and you make it prescriptive, you will absolutely hit a wall. There is no doubt. We have seen it, experienced it over and over again. And you will hit a wall. And when that wall hits, it will hit you very hard. And you're going to have a lot of issues, and you're going to have to do a lot of supplementing of the cattle and that type of thing. And so my admonition here is very simply this: I don't care what you call a grazing system, okay, total grazing, adaptive grazing, pick any name you want to. If you make it prescriptive, you're going to create issues for yourself, for your livestock, for your profitability. But if you keep it adaptive and you're introducing these planned purposeful disruptions, it will work for you, and it will work for you year after year after year. You won't have to worry about hitting that wall and hitting a threshold of progress.
I'll just add a point on that, that we're probably very blessed farming in the UK that the weather 1 year to the next is never the same. So even if you're starting with a prescriptive approach, the weather throws a spanner in the works anyway. So yeah, I've not managed to do the same thing twice yet. But yeah, I quite like what you've said, that that's a good thing that I've not managed to get that repeatability on it yet.
Yeah. The weather part was through my head as well, and so I think we've got clients that will be total grazing at times in the season. I say we're probably making use of a stockpile that's been put aside either for midsummer when it's become dry, not always midsummer, just when it's dry, or along with some bale grazing on the shoulder of spring or autumn. So it's a tool in the box. I think that's probably the best way to treat this at the minute. Is that there's a range of tools, and sometimes it's choosing which one you deploy and where you deploy it. The variability of the season, particularly more recently, is only helpful in kind of creating and aiding that disruption. I think the negative to that is it's really hard for guys to get going, because if it's not prescriptive, how do you start? And so I don't know if you've got any guidance there, Alan, in terms of how you get people going, because without some sort of format or guidelines, it can be really hard to get started and have the confidence to make that change.
Yeah, so it's really pretty simple. You do have a plan. Yeah, and but you always couple that plan with observations and with real-time conditions. Yeah, and so when we start with a client, for instance, we'll take a look at their current context and what disruptions are best for them to apply in year 1, year 2, year 3, and so forth. So we don't just blindly go in or randomly go in with disruptions. We have a plan with what disruptions we're going to use when and why. And then we're going to use our observations to help us temper that, for the next round of disruptions and the next round of recovery and rest. So you're absolutely right, James, in that you do have to have a plan. It's not just completely arbitrary. So we do set a plan, but the observations and the conditions are always going to temper that plan. And that's why we can have multiple disruptions. So if I have something happen, for instance, Joe, like I turn real drouthy, then I may have planned to do an ultra high stock density impact, but because I turn real drouthy, I'm going to alter my next disruption, and I'm not going to do an ultra high stock density. I may do something like change paddock configuration or direction, or change rest period, that type of thing instead. So that's really how we approach it. So it's not haphazard, and it's not a very difficult thing to follow at all. It becomes rather intuitive as we understand why a particular disruption would be used or why not, and as we combine that with our observations, so that intuition then becomes critical in that entire decision-making process.
Yeah,
I just
and
had
I also go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just going to add a little point on that selective grazing. That when I was first looking at the spring sort of grazing systems, and it was you want to be going into covers at 2.5, 2.8, you've got to graze it down to 1,500 or 1,700, and then when you do let covers get longer, and everyone will be telling you you're losing quality, you'll be losing milk out of the bulk tank, you'll be losing growth rate, but you end up seeing the complete opposite. And even down to seeing an animal that's not even bothered to put its head to the floor to graze the grass at the bottom, it's just picking the seed heads off the top of the grass. Well, that's kind of like feeding a grain to an animal, isn't it? But it's standing on the top of a stalk of grass. And that, again, has got to help those growth rates. But equally, that's only going to happen at certain times of the year. So, yeah, you can't have a prescription that you always go into long grasses. So yeah, that's the biggest thing my observation has been is, and it's really reassuring hearing Alan talk about it, is to actually not to have a consistent strategy. I wouldn't quite claim I'm an athlete of always having a different strategy, but I like that idea as well.
Great point, Joe. And, as you improve soil health, you also improve nutrient density of those plants, and they can hold their nutrient quality later into the season. So you'll see changes in that as well. But I just wanted to end maybe with saying, don't let perfection get in the way of improvement. For a lot of people starting out, don't think that it has to be this perfect system that you jump into. I think it was Gabe talks about one of his neighbors. He convinced just to run one poly wire down the field, cut it in half, and he gave one half a little bit of rest. And that's all the guy did. And he ended up giving that poly wire to Gabe when he passed away, saying that made a huge improvement in his pasture productivity. So yeah, if you're starting out as simple as one line down, giving half your paddock the rest, that's a good place to start, I think, in my opinion. You can differ in your opinion, Alan, or anybody, but yeah.
No, I think just do something different.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks everybody. Tom, I will pass it to you. I think we're about at the end of our time.
Yeah, thank you very much to James, Joe, Alan, and Kyle. It's been a great discussion. And just to go back to the last point, which was James's question, the purpose of the Regenerate Outcomes program is to get boots on the ground, get Kyle, Stu, and Alan to get to your farm and to start that planning process based on your context. So that's a nice segue into what we do. But please also check our website for the June workshops where Alan is coming over to Wales, Scotland, and England. Book your tickets for that. But thank you very much to the panelists and have a nice evening.